has been Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell, who for 10 years has been researching the facts behind political assassinations and conspiracies in this country. Dialogue Conspiracy originates with KELRB-FM in Carmel, California.
Good afternoon. This is Dialogue Conspiracy, Carmel, California. September the 16th, 1974. Still a warm summer afternoon out our way. And we come to the subject of Richard Nixon and his ill health and the headlines yesterday and today that he's afraid to go into the hospital for fear that he will not come out alive. It reminds me of an article done on the political assassinations in Ramparts, 1966, that all of us, the researchers, had put together, referring to the Kennedy assassination as being similar to King Tut's tomb, that those people that had any part of it or close to it would be murdered and dead. The quotation in the article began, "Death shall come on swift wings to him that touches the tomb of the Pharaoh. This is the message written upon King Tut's sarcophagus, a warning and an ancient Egyptian curse. And death can come to King Richard Nixon in a manner that it came to Lyndon B. Johnson, who was abandoned at his Texas ranch for several years following his removal from office as President of the United States. He resigned, but he went down to his ranch where he hardly left until the day that he was accompanied by Mike Howard of the CIA and Secret Service on an airplane which went farther than the nearest hospital for his fatal heart attack. And Mike Howard is the agent from the CIA responsible for the conversion of Marina Oswald from the helpless wife of Lee Harvey Oswald into the female that would lie and plant evidence against her husband and tell many lies to the Warren Commission in exchange for her citizenship. And Mike Howard was the agent that worked with Marina Oswald. He was the man that was with Lyndon Johnson when he died. Richard Nixon knows how J. Edgar Hoover passed away alone and poisoned in his isolated bed, how Hale Boggs was sent in an airplane over Alaska and disposed. He was a member of the Warren Commission who was checking into the links of the Watergate to the Warren Commission. Richard Nixon knows how Mary Jo Kopechne died, drugged to sleep, left to drown in the back of a car. His pal Murray Chotiner, victim of a government employee hit and run accident, and Clay Shaw died less than a month ago, poisoned, and left in his lonely room to be found dead. He was a co-worker of the Howard Hunt on the JFK assassination team. And Richard Nixon knows about David Ferry, the victim of a karate chop to his neck, who was murdered in order to protect Clay Shaw and the higher-ups of the high-level assassination team, and his old pal William Nolan, who died by a lonely river, left to die with a single bullet in his head, and Congressman William Mills, recipient of $25,000 secret Republican funds, who was murdered at 7 o'clock in the morning at the side of his stables. And what about Beverly Kay, the White House secretary, murdered from an injected air bubble following her typing of the future, missing famous 18-minute tapes from the White House? And wasn't Beverly Kay the secretary of Mr. Stephen Bull, who is in charge of Richard Nixon now? And what about CIA bagwoman Dorothy Hunt and the blackmailing and the threatening that goes on? So the ex-president says, if I go to the hospital, I will die. And the Fourth Estate repeats this, an important branch of the police state, and nobody bothers to ask Nixon what he knows or why he would die, or whether he'd die in the hospital or out of the hospital. If he goes into the hospital, they have the embolism taken care of. He says he won't come out alive. It's the ordinary treatment of an ordinary patient, but this isn't an ordinary patient. And as the military doctor said, Air Force Major General Walter Tkach, he said this morning in the newspaper out here, the pardon didn't do him a damn bit of good. There are the same uncertainties about his diagnosis and mysterious ailment, the phlebitis, whether it's above the knee, below the levels of the skin. And according to the doctors today, Richard Nixon allegedly had a phlebitis for 10 years. It's interesting that he had a checkup every year and was in the perfect condition, and nobody mentioned this phlebitis until this July, when he was about to take a trip to the Middle East at the heat of the Watergate controversy. A year to the day, he was at the hospital for his famous summer pneumonia, and I wonder about that diagnosis also. Did the phlebitis actually begin November 21st, 1963? The same night that Richard Nixon, former Vice President of the United States, met with J. Edgar Hoover in the Dallas home of Clint Murchison? When the phlebitis began 10 years ago, I wonder at what point in history the Kennedy assassination isn't going to bring this whole team down with them one by one. So a slip of the tongue of the doctor setting the date 10 years ago that the phlebitis caught Richard Nixon reminds me of the curse of King Tut's tomb. The Watergate-related deaths already have reached 65 or more. What do you think this is all about? Have you figured it out? Why is it taking so long to figure out? And do you think it's possible that the scandal that Richard Nixon is being protected from would get into the shooting of Governor Wallace or the murder of Mary Jo Kopechne, which were very much in the realm of the 1972 elections, but the Senate Select Committee forgot to go into them? The news of the week, this past week, September the 9th through September the 15th, came out like a flash flood. Articles were spread all over my desk. New files were started. The first, of course, was Gerald Ford's unconditional pardon just a week ago yesterday to the very man who had appointed him President of the United States, private citizen Richard M. Nixon. The second news effect, the pile of articles I have, is on the provisions for the secret White House tapes. They're stringent, they're expensive, but it's a cheap price to keep certain secrets locked up. And it's very hard to believe that all of this worrying about those tapes and the protection of them has to do with entering the Watergate Hotel. One condition of the tape secrecy is that they become destroyed if Mr. Richard Nixon dies. At the press conference this afternoon, the question was asked Gerald Ford about that condition if Richard Nixon dies, and in his usual slick manner, he passed it over. Get a transcript of the press conference today and see his answer to that. The tapes originally were to be sent out to California, 12 miles from San Clemente. The taxpayers would pay $100,000 for a secret vault. $50,000 a year was to be spent or would be spent for 5 years for 5 people to guard them and lock them up. They must be pretty valuable tapes. Another point in the news this week was Gerald Ford let it be known, in the tradition of his Warren Commission experience, that the military intelligence will decide for us what it is good for us to know. Mr. Ford has said as he's privy to some information that he might never make public. Now, in the press conference again, Gerald Ford said he was more anxious to heal the nation and heal the wounds and get on with the business. That was the exact excuse they used 10 years ago for the Warren Commission, of which he was a member. We have to heal the wounds of the nation. That is why Earl Warren lied, John J. McCloy lied, Gerald Ford lied. They signed their name to this Lee Harvey Oswald lone assassin, a bunch of baloney, because their interpretation was that the nation couldn't stand the truth. Now, that's only their interpretation. I believe the nation can stand the truth, and I resent the fact that they have this paternal attitude that he is healing the nation. This nation has been ruptured because we've never gone into the actual evidence that exists in the John Kennedy assassination on upward for the past 10 years. And for these people from the military intelligence to interpret to us what they decide is good for us and what is good for the nation to know is a bunch of baloney. And you have to let your feelings be known that he is not the one to guard over and decide how he's going to heal the nation. What he does only keeps compounding the cancer on the presidency, the illness in our country, the denial of the conspiracies and assassinations. Leon Jaworski, in the tradition of his Warren Commission work, because he was paid by the state of Texas to guard the interests of the state of Texas on the Warren Commission, showed his CIA cover-up ability and sanctioned the pardon and the tape giveaway because Ford and Jaworski were brought into the Watergate when they realized that the team was being uncovered in Dallas, and they needed these two men in the position, and they're serving the military intelligence now. Also in this week, John Ehrlichman was squeaking about his trial. He asked for the Segretti papers. That's a form of blackmail because John Ehrlichman knows the Segretti case was put under the rug, and that Segretti served a short amount of time, like 6 months or 60 days, I guess it was, at a Lompoc, the funny farm for the very elite out here in California. But the Segretti affair and the money would lead to Chappaquiddick. It could lead to the Miami provocateurs. It could also lead to money in Milwaukee, Maryland, and possibly the money that went to Arthur Bremer. So John Ehrlichman is saying, I want those papers, and that could bring out more evidence. Robert Haldeman was in allegedly on a blackmail stint. The night before Richard Nixon went out of office, he was asking that he and his sidekick Ehrlichman get clemency. The news this week says that Haldeman was threatening to put Richard Nixon in jail if he didn't get pardoned. The Secret Service was going to place Robert Haldeman out under house arrest in fall of 1972, in case you don't remember that, because Richard Nixon's life was in danger at the time. And through my research, Robert Haldeman was figured by myself as being the #1 spy in the White House against Richard Nixon. This may come as a surprise to you, and that is one of the reasons that he had access and knew about the tapes that would bring Richard Nixon down. Haldeman is a person who wanted Nixon to go into a large crowd similar to what Wallace did in the Maryland Shopping Center, and the Secret Service agents had an argument with him 2 summers ago and threatened to put him under house arrest, but the Secret Service agent was fired and Haldeman remained in the White House. And that's the friend of Richard Nixon who is threatening to put Richard Nixon in jail, allegedly. This week, the news surfaced about General Haig, who he is, what he's doing, that he's the man running the office of the presidency of the United States. General Haig will be leaving shortly, thank goodness. It's not a surprise to me that Gerald Ford found that he was taking memos and orders from General Haig. Anybody who's listened to Dialogue Conspiracy out here on the West Coast or back east for any length of time knows that I compare General Haig to those generals that were originally colonels in Greece and overthrew the established military and came into power swiftly. Haig jumped over 243 other military officers for his position as general. He represents the interests of Henry Kissinger, who's doing boot work, pocketbook diplomacy for Nelson Rockefeller, ITT, Chase National Bank, Exxon, and 14 other major corporations who own America. Haig worked with Roy Ash of the Office of Management Budget and John Ehrlichman, the domestic staff, Fred Malek, Mr. Cole, the men that have been creating economic chaos inside the United States, giving funding, unlimited funding for surplus arms, and at the same time tying up domestic money for systems of justice or immediate needs, creating the situation that we're in today. The president may say, let's end Watergate and get on to the real problems of the economy. But it's these men from West Point, the military generals that have fouled up the economy that are running the White House. That's why the economy's bankrupt. You can't get back to the problems until you get West Point out of the White House and let them take care of the battles and out the domestic scene. They go together. So when Gerald Ford says we have to get on to the other, there's too much turmoil and divisions in the country, we have to solve the real problems. And yet, there aren't many investigators saying the real problem comes because the Pentagon makes the president do something in spite of his better judgment otherwise. Well, this week in the news we had William Colby pulling the rug out of Henry Kissinger's ego trip. All of a sudden, our acting head of the CIA is charging Henry Kissinger almost single-handedly for using $11 million tax dollars to overthrow Chile and for delivering Chile to Rockefeller, Anaconda Copper, ITT, AT&T, Standard Oil in New Jersey, Crown Zellerbach, Corning Glass, Kippers Corporation, Pan American World Airways, United Fruit, General Mills, and the list goes on. And somewhere out of the news came that mysterious 40 group that you're reading about, the 40 Committee. Well, in all of my research on the book that I'm doing called Murderville, USA, on the overthrowing of countries outside of the United States and the plans to take over the United States through this link of the Office of Management Budget or the Domestic Council, we always get back to the 40 Committee inside the National Security Council. This team has worked for 25 years ordering murders, overthrowing governments, for the purpose of ensuring higher profits at slave labor overseas and also at home. And all of a sudden, the power struggle at the top is so great that the CIA is fingering Henry Kissinger, which in turn is saying Nelson Rockefeller. And the boat is rocking back in Washington, D.C. The power struggle is tangling each other. But there's no way that Henry Kissinger can overthrow Chile without agents of the CIA. So what you're seeing at the top is a power struggle which is consistent with my research in the past years, and now they're bursting at each other's throats. So Mr. Colby is willing to testify on evidence that Kissinger perjured himself when he became Secretary of State. But in the meantime, we get a better glimpse of the 40 Committee that I've been warning you about. A lot of people have asked me for books on research, and if you send a self-addressed envelope, I'll give you a bibliography of books. When I speak to colleges or high schools, I always refer to a book by David Weiss called The Invisible Government. And The Invisible Government is about the 40 Committee. And I've been referring to that book for 3.5 years of my public life and all the time I've been doing my research. So just this week, that committee surfaced, and don't take it lightly. I'm running through a few items in the news this week, but they're all terribly important and linked to the subject of murders and conspiracies. Also, Gerald Ford's first appointment quit, and that is very important news. Gerald Terhorst resigned. Long-standing friend, co-worker, he lasted exactly 1 month in the White House, 30 days. Then he realized that the Pentagon rules the Oval Office. He said, I don't want to be another Ziegler. He packed up his bags and went back to Michigan, where he can always be employed. The behavior of Terhorst reminds me of a poem that's important by Robinson Jeffers, a native from Carmel, California, who lived here. He wrote many beautiful poems, but he had one called Corruption Has Never Been Compulsory. I'll read you a few lines of the poem because Terhorst has the chance to quit. People like Gerald Ford back there are still covering up. Robinson Jeffers said, while this America settles in the mold of vulgarity, heavily thickening into empire, and protest only a bubble in the molten mass, pops and sighs out and the mass hardens. The poet will do well to keep his distance from the thickening center because corruption has never been compulsory. It is only we who stand outside the corruption of hypocrisy and murder who are the prophets of true religion. Today is a day of guns. We will make tomorrow a way of peace. Today is a day of prisons. We will make it a day of freedom. They are all liars, knowingly using the language of love to peddle the poison of death. Power pollutes whatever it touches. It makes slaves of gullible men, and it makes men of reason into mechanized automatons. Back to the news of the week. It was quite evident in several columns that Spiro Agnew isn't going to give up easily either. Frank Sinatra and Spiro Agnew have a new love affair. They're courting the injured George Wallace. They're down funding of George Wallace. Not much money, it's true, but they've decided they like George Wallace, and these two sidekicks are down with him. Now, Agnew, you remember, was the governor of Maryland. The shooting of George Wallace was in Maryland. It could be that Agnew was kicked out of office just too quickly following the elections, that he knows public officials in Maryland, he knows the police in Maryland because that's his home territory. And it could be that he has information that would leak out to Governor Wallace about who shot him and how the persons who were involved with Arthur Bremer got away, another car, another second gunman, possibly a second gunman. Last week we talked about Martha Mitchell being down visiting Mrs. Wallace, leaking out hints about the conspiracy to shoot George Wallace. And a well-known attorney from Washington, D.C., who's representing one of the Watergate defendants who threatened to burn every tree in the forest, has also been visiting George Wallace, for whatever that's worth. So the fears go on, and the White House is going to be forced to explain someday where all the money went to defeat George Wallace that wasn't delivered into his opponent's hands. So you can see why there was a blanket pardon for Richard Nixon for any and all crimes that may have been done while he was in office. Now, it's very interesting, the reading of that pardon, because this is the way it went. The pardon said, no matter how controversial, the pardon cannot be withdrawn. It cannot be overturned or challenged in courts. Legal scholars may debate the constitutionality of granting a pardon when never charged with a crime, but the pardon will endure. Mr. Ford cannot change his mind. He can never rescind the pardon. A pardon is a contract. Once it is accepted, it is final. Mr. Nixon's pardon is unconditional, full, free, and absolute. And when Gerald Ford, the President of the United States, read about the pardon a week ago this Sunday, September the 8th, related to Richard Nixon, he said it is for any Watergate-related crimes from July 20th, 1969 until August the 9th, 1974. Now, some aides reminded later Gerald Ford what he had said. Richard Nixon took oath of office January 69. But the pardon originally, when he read it over the air and read it out loud, was from July 20th, 1969. Now, isn't it interesting that Mary Jo Kopechne died July 20th, 1969? Are these Freudian slips, or are they meant to tell us something? First, we're told that Richard Nixon's phlebitis started 10 years ago, and here he is linking with the whole Kennedy assassination team, and we'll run down their names again, particularly Ford and Jaworski. And the phlebitis could be fatal or go to his heart, and he's afraid he's going to die because of this phlebitis, and it's dated 10 years ago. And then in the same week, this kind of information comes out dating a phlebitis nobody knew about. Gerald Ford, President of the United States, makes a slip of the tongue and frees him from any Watergate-related crimes July 20th, 1969. And those of you who know my research, who know my work, know that I believe that Mary Jo Kopechne was in back of the car and could not wake up to save herself from a drowning, and that I believe Ted Kennedy was not driving that car. Now, opening up the Kopechne case, it would involve Donald Segretti, E. Howard Hunt, Herbert Kalmbach. Kalmbach gave $100,000 to Tony Laswitz in the summer of 1969, and Tony Laswitz was up at Chappaquiddick the night that Mary Jo Kopechne was murdered, giving press releases about Ted Kennedy. I can't believe that any press man gets a salary of that kind. It would be interesting to know what Kalmbach was raising that kind of money for in the summer of 69 that went to Tony Laswitz alone. So John Caulfield, Donald Segretti, Herbert Kalmbach, the whole team, and E. Howard Hunt should be called under oath to talk about what happened at Chappaquiddick and be held either for perjury or to tell the truth. But they haven't been called in yet. But the point is that Richard Nixon was supposed to be relieved of any crime from July 20th, 69. Well, the honeymoon is over with Gerald Ford. It was a flaky marriage to begin with. There was a lot of furor this last week. I was up in Sacramento speaking at the convention, the California Bar, to the lawyers' wives, and I spent a lot of time meeting various people in the media there, did several hours of television. And it was an interesting week to be away because the disillusionment with Gerald Ford was coming down with the media people. And I couldn't believe how naive these people are, that they didn't know about Gerald Ford being on the Warren Commission and didn't know about Jaworski's work with Jack Ruby and Gerald Ford. And it was unbelievable how much of a news blackout there is. And to find that out, you leave home and leave KLRB and leave your research and get out in the world, and you realize that there's this big blackout about these facts, even at the confirmation hearing of Gerald Ford. Well, he talked about a marriage with a nation, and he's been president for a month. It was a flaky marriage to begin with. Richard Nixon appointed Gerald Ford as the Republican representative for the Warren Commission. As acting vice president, he appointed Ford to be on the Warren Commission. Gerald Ford, as the ranking Republican in the House, had called in members of the House Banking and Currency Committee in 1972 and allegedly was responsible for killing a crucial vote that would decide if Chairman Wright Patman could investigate the funding behind the Watergate affair. Ford said he was worried about the Republican victory in 1972 elections and only had a meeting with the Republicans to talk about that. The political victory was more important than catching some crooks, particularly when the crooks are members of your own party. Gerald Ford lied CIA style as confirmation hearings regarding this cover-up. Senator Robert Byrd asked him about blocking the Patman investigation, and he said, not to my best recollection. He did have interviews with Republicans, but to his best recollection, he didn't remember blocking telling them to block the deciding vote to investigate the funding of the Watergate people. The best recollection is a CIA witness term. Witnesses get on the stand and say, I can't recall, or not to my best recollection. I clued into that when I was reading the witness testimony in the Warren Commission hearings of the 552 witnesses. I never saw so many people who couldn't recollect one thing but could recollect another with exact detail. So to his best recollection, he couldn't remember what he said to the Republicans on the Senate committee, but after they went back and voted, not one of them would vote for investigating the funding of the Watergate. Gerald Ford was telling another lie about the U.S. funding to overthrow Chile, the money that came from the CIA. The headlines this week said the CIA money that was funded to overthrow Chile was, in quotes, so hush-hush even Ford didn't know. Now, how is it possible that Gerald Ford didn't know the 40 Committee played a key role in the U.S. intervention in Chile between 1970 and 1973, when I can figure that out, cross-filed in my study, all the way out here in Carmel without one investigative agent working for me? I began to think I should be President of the United States instead of Gerald Ford, because if he's that ignorant, either he's the worst liar in the world, as evidence of his work on the Warren Commission and other testimony he's fallen back on, or he has to be terribly stupid. A close friend of President Ford said he's convinced that Ford was not aware of the committee's existence when he became president, even though as vice president he was one of the National Security Council's 4 statutory members. He worked there with the president and with the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and he says the group is so hush-hush that even he doesn't know it. To understand Gerald Ford and Leon Jaworski, you have to realize the massive covering up job they did for the murder of the President of the United States in 1963. And then you know why Richard Nixon put them on board the ship when the Watergate arrest took place. Agnew had to be removed. They had to make room for Gerald Ford, who had been in this all the way since Dallas with the CIA and Nixon. Archibald Cox had to be removed as special prosecutor to make way for Leon Jaworski, because they were hitting the CIA Mexican money coming from Houston to Mexico that had been involved in all the assassinations. Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. The links of the Mexican money washing, the hired assassins, the murder team. Jaworski was head of the CIA Anderson Foundation down in Houston, and it was absolutely necessary to put a lid on the investigations. And it's easy to see now why Gerald